So now turning to the second part of my presentation, I'll talk a little bit briefly about how it was understood at the time and by later generations of Soviet historians. So, as Nicolo has told us, the party secretary for much of the famine was a guy named Filip Isaievich Goloshokin. He's a very interesting figure. He himself is an old Bolshevik. That means that his ties extended. He was someone who joined the party early. At the time of, during the famine, in late 1932, Moscow actually charges Goloshokin with committing what they called to be distortions or errors. They did not admit to a famine, but they said that he had committed errors in his leadership of the Republic. Goloshokin is fired from his position. He's replaced by Mirzayan. And this kind of framework or understanding of the Kazakh disaster continues throughout the Soviet period. Later generations of Soviet historians acknowledge that the party made mistakes in collectivization. They don't talk about a famine. These mistakes are often blamed on Goloshokin when the issue of numbers and the sort of huge drop in the number of Kazakhs living in Kazakhstan comes up. One of the explanations given is, oh, well, they all fled. They fled to different republics, and thus this is why the numbers are lower. And of course, we know that explanation, of course, is not wholly true. So for a long time in Kazakhstan, there was very little discussion of the famine. One way that I found it was discussed, however, very early on, is in literature, actually in Kazakh language publications. But these discussions really did not discuss the disaster's basic causes. And of course, the archives were not open, so they could not do that. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, demographers, mostly publishing in Kazakh, discover Kazakhstan's horrifying loss of life. They begin to publish studies about this and begins to be talked about openly. In 1992, there is a government commission under the auspices of President Nursultan Nazarbayev. And this commission investigates the disaster on the basis of archival information and argues that the Kazakh famine should be considered a genocide. So in the 1990s, the topic of the famine is very widely discussed in Kazakh and Russian language popular and scholarly media. Some of these studies actually even repeat some of the Soviet explanations for the famine, which is a bit strange. So many of them also place a huge amount of emphasis on Goloshokin. There's also a sort of, in a limited number of these studies, there's a very kind of nasty element to it. Goloshokin himself is Jewish. Some of these studies take on either kind of explicitly or implicitly kind of anti-Semitic aspect. There are a number of really interesting studies done by local historians in this period. There's two that I'll just briefly mention. One is by Julduzbek Abulhojan, who looks at the regime's failure to understand the challenges of the natural environment. And another scholar is Talis Omarbekov, who looks very closely at the role of meat procurements in the disasters in the famine. So by the late 1990s, however, there's a turn in how the Kazakh famine is approached. Study of the Kazakh famine is largely abandoned. This was more or less the case when I was actually researching my dissertation. I was very stunned to find that when I was researching my dissertation, I would often try to seek out local scholars working on the famine, and they would tell me, well, that's very nice, you're working on that now, but we've solved that, we've solved that problem, we've moved on. I said, well, what do you mean solved? So there was a turn away from the disaster itself. I think there are a lot of reasons for it. I can go into it more in the Q&A. I don't think it's all necessarily about Kazakhstan's relationship with Russia. But just to give you one concrete example of this. I was really struck when I was in Kazakhstan. I heard there was a memorial to the famine. And I went to many different historians of the famine. And I said, where is the memorial? And they didn't know. No one could tell me where the memorial was. So I spent many days circling around parks in Almaty trying to find it. And finally, I found it in a corner of a park where it was all grown over with weeds and covered, with cracked bottles and so on. And so, it says that, it says in Kazakh and in Russian, in this place, a monument to the victims of the famine of 1931 to 33 will be built. And it had stood something just like that, for 10 years. And nothing had been done to it. So that's sort of an illustration of the way that they moved away from discussion of this. However, in 2012, there was a signal basically from President Nursultan Nazarbayev to organize a conference. He organized a conference in honor of the 80th anniversary of the Kazakh Famine, and I was there. And one of the interesting things is just a side note, I have to tell you, so I was actually that close to Nazarbayev. It was very interesting. I did not go through any security detectors. Nazarbayev himself, there's no clear air, so it was rather interesting that I was able to get that close without being examined by anyone. So Nazarbayev is actually standing at a podium. He's introducing the new famine memorial, which is in Astana. By this conference, it was a big international conference. It really dominated the media that day, and huge numbers of many local officials came to it. Nazarbayev really signaled that, okay, limited discussion of the famine is going to begin. But he really, I would say in his speech, he really set out the terms under which this would happen in Kazakhstan. There are basically plans for a new multi-volume document collection, The Tragedy of the Kazakh Aul, which I think should really help our understanding of this period. The first volume of that is already out. Furthers are forthcoming. There's this new monument which has been built in Astana. And at this point, Nazarbayev, however, he really argues against the dangers of what he claims to be politicizing disaster. He refrains from his speech. He does not call the Kazakh famine a genocide. And his approach, I would say in many respects, is very closely aligned with the approach that the Russian government has taken with the collectivization famines. And I was just talking actually with Nicolo about this. One of the interesting things now is in this new climate, many of the scholars who were some of the most adamant on the genocide position are now slightly retreating, actually, from some of their claims. So turning to the third part of my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about what Western scholarship on the Kazakh famine has contributed, what we know, and what we still don't know. So the earliest studies by Western scholars were really hampered by a lack of archival access. They largely framed really the disaster as a kind of miscalculation on the basis of Stalin. They argue that he really poorly understood the mechanics of the Kazakh pastoral nomadic economies. So examples of this would be the work of Martha Brill Alcott and also Robert Conquest in his seminal work on the Ukrainian famine has a chapter on the Kazakh famine, which really draws largely on Alcott's work. More recently, however, an international group of scholars have begun to reconsider the Kazakh famine. These scholars have benefited from the opening of archives, of course, in Moscow and in Kazakhstan. There are very rich materials in Kazakhstan, particularly in the presidential or party archives. And Kazakhstan, in that sense, is a bit distinct from many other parts of Central Asia. The party archives are open in Kazakhstan. They're not open to foreign researchers, for instance, in Uzbekistan. So each of these scholars, and you have two of them here before you, has chosen different chronological frameworks and lenses with which to view the famine. And I think one of the things this illustrates the different ways that we have chosen to approach famine is the kind of the many different ways that famine itself can be framed. One can use economic history, one can use social history, environmental history. I believe it's a phenomenon that requires a multitude of different types of approaches.